On February 24, 1994, police began digging up a garden in Gloucester, England. They did not stop for weeks. Beneath the patio, beneath the cellar floor, beneath the bathroom extension of an ordinary three-story house at 25 Cromwell Street, they found 9 sets of human remains. The house belonged to a builder named Fred West and his wife Rose. They had 10 children. They rented rooms to lodgers. Neighbors waved to them in the street. And for more than 20 years, no one, not the tenants who slept 1 floor above the cellar, not the social workers who visited the family, not the police officers who had stood in that hallway before, suspected that they were standing inside one of the most prolific crime scenes in British history. This is the question this case forces us to answer, not how 2 people could commit at least 12 murders, but how a house that full, that watched, that ordinary, could keep them invisible for 27 years. The answer begins long before Cromwell Street. It begins in 2 childhoods 100 miles apart that built 2 damaged people and then collided. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on September 29, 1941, in the village of Muchmarkel, Herefordshire, a farming community of a few hundred people near the Welsh border. He was the first surviving child of Walter and Daisy West, farm labourers who would go on to have 6 children in a cramped cottage without indoor plumbing. The West family was poor even by the standards of rural wartime England. Fred left school at 15, barely able to read or write, a limitation that would follow him into every police interview room for the rest of his life, and one that investigators would later note he learned to weaponize, playing the harmless, muddled country labourer whenever scrutiny came close. Accounts of Fred's childhood are contested, and it is worth being precise about what is documented and what came only from Fred's own mouth. Fred later claimed that incest was treated casually in his childhood home. No independent evidence ever corroborated this, and Fred West was a compulsive, strategic liar, a man who confessed, retracted, embellished, and reinvented constantly. What is documented is this: he grew up in isolation, in poverty, with minimal education, and he idolized his mother to a degree that neighbors found unusual. Then came the injuries. In November 1958, at 17, Fred crashed his motorcycle on a country road. He fractured his skull, broke his leg and arm, and lay in a coma for days. Surgeons inserted a metal plate into his head. Those who knew him said he came back different, prone to sudden, explosive rages, impulsive in a way he had not been before. 2 years later, he suffered a second head injury, knocked unconscious in a fall. Modern forensic psychology treats adolescent frontal lobe trauma as a documented risk factor for impaired impulse control. Not a cause of what followed, never an excuse, but a data point that appears again and again in case histories like this one. The first documented alarm came in 1961. Fred, then 19, was charged after a 13-year-old girl, known to his family, became pregnant and named him. The case collapsed before trial when the girl declined to testify. Fred's own family had thrown him out over the allegation, and then, within months, took him back. It is the first entry in a pattern that will repeat across this entire case. An accusation surfaces, the system touches Fred West, and then lets go. In 1962, Fred married Catherine Costello, a 19-year-old Scottish woman everyone called Rena. She was pregnant by another man when they married. Her daughter Charmaine was born in March 1963, and Fred registered himself as the father. A second daughter, Anne-Marie, followed in 1964, Fred's biological child. The family moved to Glasgow, where Fred drove an ice cream van. In late 1965, that van struck and killed a small boy in an accident. Fred was not charged, but the incident made the neighbourhood hostile, and the family moved back south to Gloucestershire, bringing with them a young nanny, a friend of Rena's, named Anna McFall. Remember Anna McFall's name. She is, as far as any investigator has ever been able to establish, the first. By 1967, Rena had left Fred and returned to Scotland, and Anna McFall had stayed. She was 18, and she was pregnant with Fred's child. Witnesses later said she had begun pressing Fred to divorce Rena and marry her. In July 1967, Anna McFall disappeared. No one reported her missing in any way that produced an investigation. She was young, Scottish, far from home, in an era when a working-class girl leaving town raised no institutional eyebrow whatsoever. Her remains were found 27 years later, in 1994, buried in a field near Muchmarkel called Fingerpost Field, dismembered, buried with her unborn child, and investigators noted something that would become a signature detail across this case. Small bones, fingers and toes were missing from the grave. It was the first appearance of a pattern so consistent that forensic teams would come to use it as an identifier. Fred West was 25 years old. Whatever line separates fantasy from action had already been crossed, quietly in a green field, with no one watching. 6 months later, in January 1968, a 15-year-old girl named Mary Bastholm vanished from a bus stop in Gloucester on her way to visit her boyfriend. She worked at a cafe Fred West frequented. He had done building work connected to the premises. Mary Bastholm has never been found. Fred West was never charged with her disappearance, and decades later, as recently as 2021, when police excavated the cellar of that former cafe following a documentary team's findings, searches for her remains have come up empty. She remains one of this case's open wounds, and we will return to her at the end, because the question of how many victims this case actually has is one the official number of 12 has never honestly answered. Now stop the clock. Because in November 1968, on a bus in Cheltenham, Fred West meets a 15-year-old girl named Rosemary Letts. And to understand what happens next, to understand how the second half of this partnership was even possible, you have to understand where Rose came from. Rosemary Pauline Letts was born on November 29, 1953, in Northam, Devon, the fifth of 7 children. Her father, Bill Letts, was later diagnosed with schizophrenia. What his family experienced, diagnosis aside, was documented tyranny. He ruled the household through violence and obsessive control. Beatings for unswept floors, for noise, for nothing. Her mother, Daisy, suffered severe depression, and in 1953, while pregnant with Rose, she underwent repeated electroconvulsive therapy. Whether that treatment affected the developing child is medically unresolvable, but it tells you the condition of the household Rose was born into before she drew her first breath. As a girl, she was mocked at school, performed poorly and, according to multiple accounts from within the family, was sexually abused in her childhood home. By her mid-teens, the pattern psychologists would later map was already visible. A girl habituated to violence as the texture of daily life, trained to treat domination as intimacy. In early 1969, Daisy Letts briefly left her husband, taking Rose with her, and then returned. Around this time, Rose, now 15, met Fred West, a rough, talkative labourer 12 years older, with 2 young daughters and a wife who had gone back to Scotland. Bill Letts, in one of this case's bleakest ironies, saw the danger immediately. He reported the relationship to social services. He showed up at Fred's caravan, threatening to have him charged. The machinery of protection actually engaged. And then, once again, it let go. Rose moved in with Fred as soon as legal adulthood made intervention impossible. Shortly after her 16th birthday, she was pregnant. Her daughter Heather, remember Heather because this entire case eventually turns on her, was born in October 1970. Picture the household at the start of 1971, because prosecutors would later ask a jury to picture it too. A cramped flat on Midland Road, Gloucester. Fred West, 29, serving a short prison sentence for theft and unpaid fines. Rose Letts, 17 years old, alone, caring for a newborn of her own, and Fred's 2 daughters from his marriage to Rena, Anne-Marie, 6, and Charmaine, 8. Charmaine was not Fred's biological child. Witnesses, including children who visited the flat, later described Rose's treatment of Charmaine as sadistic, even by the standards of everything else in this story. The girl bound, beaten, singled out. In June 1971, while Fred was still behind bars, Charmaine West, 8 years old, disappeared. Neighbours and schoolmates were told she had gone to live with her mother in Scotland. Her remains were found in 1994 under what had been the kitchen area of the Midland Road flat. The forensic timeline, anchored to Fred's incarceration dates, pointed at a conclusion the jury in 1995 would accept. The person who killed Charmaine was not Fred. It was Rose, 17 years old, acting alone. That timeline matters enormously, and here is why. It dismantled decades in advance the defense Rose West would eventually mount. The claim that she was only ever a battered woman under a monster's control. Whatever Rose West was, the evidence says she did not need Fred West present to kill. And then the logic of concealment produced its next step, the way it always does. When Rena Costello came down from Scotland in August 1971 looking for her daughter, she was asking the one question this couple could not survive. Rena disappeared. Her remains were found in 1994 in Letterbox Field, near Much Markle. The second body in the fields of Fred's childhood village, dismembered, the same missing small bones. The pattern now had 2 authors. In January 1972, Fred and Rose married. That September, they moved with the children into a tall, narrow house with a cellar, close to the centre of Gloucester, at an address that would eventually enter British criminal history, 25 Cromwell Street. Within months of moving in, the house nearly ended everything. And this is the moment more than any other in the entire case where the next 20 years of victims could have been prevented. In late 1972, the Wests hired a 17-year-old nanny named Caroline Owens. In December, after she quit, they lured her into their car, restrained her, and took her back to Cromwell Street, where she was held overnight and sexually assaulted by both of them. Caroline survived. She told her mother. The police were called. Fred and Rose West were arrested and charged. Everything the next 2 decades would cost was, in that moment, sitting in a case file on a prosecutor's desk. In January 1973, the case was heard at Gloucester Magistrates' Court. The charges were reduced to indecent assault. Fred and Rose West pleaded guilty. They were fined £50 each and walked out free. The magistrate reportedly accepted the picture of a married couple who had committed an aberration, not a danger. Caroline Owens, terrified, had declined to testify in a full trial, and the system took the path of least resistance. £50. Within 4 months, a young woman named Linda Guff would be buried under the bathroom at 25 Cromwell Street, and the deadliest phase of this case would begin. To understand what happened between 1973 and 1979, you have to understand what 25 Cromwell Street actually was, because it was not a fortress, it was the opposite. It was one of the most open houses on the street. The house stood 3 stories tall, narrow, semi-detached, a short walk from Gloucester city centre, next door to a Seventh-day Adventist church. Fred West, a builder by trade, never stopped modifying it, extending the back, converting rooms, digging. The upper floors were rented out to lodgers, young people, drifters, students, teenagers who had left home or aged out of care. Rent was cheap and the rules were loose. At times, 8 or more lodgers lived there alongside the growing West family. Downstairs, Rose West worked as a prostitute, advertised in contact magazines, receiving clients in a designated room, a business Fred not only tolerated but managed, drilling a peephole to watch. Children were born from these encounters. Rose would eventually have 8 children, at least 2 fathered by clients. The house was loud, crowded, chaotic, full of strangers coming and going at all hours. Hold that image, because it destroys the assumption every neighbor and every institution made for 2 decades. The instinct is to believe that horror requires isolation. A remote farmhouse, a locked basement no one visits. Cromwell Street proves the opposite proposition, and it is the thesis of this entire case. The best camouflage is not emptiness, it is noise. A house with that many people, that many comings and goings, generates so much ordinary explanation that extraordinary explanations never surface. A girl stops appearing at breakfast. Lodgers move on constantly, digging in the cellar. Fred's always building something, screaming. There are 10 kids in there. The traffic itself was the cover. And there was a darker function too. The lodgers were not just income. They were a supply line. Young women at the loosest, least documented moment of their lives, new to the city, estranged from family, out of care homes, living 1 floor above a cellar that Fred West had begun to soundproof. The first victim of the Cromwell Street era was one of them. Linda Guff was 19, a seamstress from Gloucester, sociable, connected to the lodgers upstairs. In April 1973, 3 months after the £50 fine, she moved into the house. Within days, she vanished. And what happened next tells you exactly how the West method worked, because Linda's mother did what almost no one else in this case ever got the chance to do. She came to the door and asked. Rose West answered it, wearing, Mrs. Guff would later testify, Linda's slippers, with Linda's clothes drying on the line behind her. Rose said Linda had moved on, gone to Weston-super-Mare for work, and the lie held, because it was plausible. That is the horror of it. Young women did move on. Mrs. Guff went to Weston looking for her daughter. The trail died. Linda Guff's remains were found 21 years later beneath the ground-floor bathroom, dismembered, the same missing small bones, and one detail that marked a new stage in the couple's method, evidence of restraint. The killings at Cromwell Street were not rages, they were sessions. The victims were held. The forensic evidence would later suggest possibly for days. Now the pace accelerates, and notice something as it does. The victims stop being connected to the house. The couple starts hunting outward. Carol Ann Cooper, everyone called her Kaz, was 15, living in a children's home in Worcester. On the night of November 10th, 1973, she left a cinema with friends and boarded a bus toward her grandmother's house. Somewhere between the bus stop and the front door, she was taken. The working conclusion, the Wests cruising in their car, offering a lift on a cold night to a girl alone, was never provable in detail, because by the time her remains were found under the house in 1994, only the couple knew, and their accounts were worthless. A girl from a children's home. When she failed to return, the institutional reflex filed her as a runaway. Absconder. Case note. Closed folder. Lucy Partington was different, and her difference matters to how you should think about victim selection. Lucy was 21, a final-year medieval history student at Exeter University, from a stable, educated, middle-class family. The novelist Martin Amis was her cousin. On December 27, 1973, she visited a friend in Cheltenham and walked to a bus stop on the A435 to catch the 10 o'clock bus home. She was carrying university application forms. She was never seen again. Her family did everything the Cooper case lacked: immediate reports, publicity, sustained pressure. It made no difference, because there was nothing to connect a missing student in Cheltenham to a builder's family house in Gloucester. Investigators later noted a chilling forensic echo, days after Lucy disappeared. In the early hours of January 3rd, Fred West appeared at a hospital casualty department to have a deep laceration stitched. An injury consistent, the prosecution would argue, with a knife slipping during dismemberment. Lucy Partington's remains were found beneath the cellar in 1994. For 20 years, while her family searched, she had been 20 miles away, under a house other people lived in. Understand what the cellar had become by 1974, because the house itself was now part of the method. Fred had soundproofed it. The children were told it was off-limits, though the older children would later testify they understood, in the wordless way children understand, that the cellar was where bad things happened, because bad things happened to them there too. Anne-Marie, Fred's daughter, was subjected from the age of 8 to systematic sexual abuse by both Fred and Rose, documented in her own later testimony, which would become some of the most devastating evidence at trial. The West children grew up inside a regime of abuse and terror, calibrated precisely so that the outside world saw nothing. They went to school, they were fed, and they were trained. By punishment, and by the constant invoked threat that they would end up under the patio like heather, never to speak. That phrase, keep it. It is the thread the whole case will eventually unravel by. In April 1974, Therese Siegenthaler, a 21-year-old Swiss sociology student living in London, set off hitchhiking toward Ireland. A completely unremarkable way for a European student to travel in 1974. She never arrived. Her route would have taken her along roads the Wests drove. Her remains were found beneath the cellar. Because she was a foreign national, the missing persons machinery moved even more slowly. A Swiss report, a London address, no UK family applying pressure. Fred West would later refer to her in his rambling confessions as Tulip, a Dutch girl. He never even knew her nationality. That detail is worth pausing on. He did not know who she was. The victims were not chosen as people. They were chosen as opportunities. Shirley Hubbard was 15 on a work placement at a department store makeup counter in Worcester. On November 14, 1974, she left to meet her boyfriend and took a bus toward Droitwich. She vanished from the roadside. Her remains, found in the cellar in 1994, carried the single most disturbing forensic signature of the entire case, a detail I will describe only to the degree the trial did, because it proved intent beyond anything words could. Her skull was still wrapped in a mask made of overlapping loops of tape, with a plastic tube inserted to allow breathing. The construction of that apparatus takes time, care, and planning. It is not the artifact of an outburst. It is equipment. When people ask how a jury could be certain these deaths were not accidents that a panicked couple concealed, this is how. Juanita Mott was 18, a former Cromwell Street lodger, the supply line again, living in Newent in April 1975 when she disappeared, planning to attend a wedding that weekend. Her remains showed she had been suspended and bound with an improvised harness of ropes and tights. Again, apparatus. Again, time. Again, no one connected a missing former lodger to the house she had once lived in because she had left it, and leaving was normal. Then, for roughly 3 years, the documented killings stop, or at least no victim from 1975 to 1978 has ever been identified. Investigators have never believed the couple simply paused. The more likely explanations are victims never found or never linked. Hold that uncertainty. It returns at the end of this case with a number attached. What is documented in those years is the family's public normalization. The Wests bought the house outright in 1977 with a council-assisted mortgage. Fred worked steadily. More children were born, and in 1977 a new lodger arrived, Shirley Robinson, 18, a former care home resident, vulnerable in every way the house selected for. By early 1978, she was pregnant with Fred West's child, and by several accounts she talked openly about it, imagining a future in which she, not Rose, was the woman of the house. She was answering a question nobody should ever have asked inside those walls. What happens when a secret keeper becomes a threat to the household structure? Rena Costello had already answered it. In May 1978, Shirley Robinson disappeared, heavily pregnant. She was buried in the back garden. The house itself was full. Other lodgers were told she had gone to Germany. They believed it. Everyone always believed it. The last victim of this phase, the last of the 9 bodies that would be found at Cromwell Street, was Alison Chambers, 16, a Welsh girl from Swansea, living in a Gloucester children's home, due to start work as a solicitor's office junior. Alison dreamed, her friends later said, of living in the countryside. In August 1979 she vanished. The Wests, it emerged, had shown her a photograph of a farm and promised her exactly that dream. A place with them, away from the care system. A farm that did not exist. She was buried in the garden near Shirley Robinson. Her care home marked her as an absconder. The file closed. She was 3 weeks short of her 17th birthday. Count what the institutions had at this point, scattered across a decade. A 1961 charge involving a minor dropped. A 1972 abduction and assault case pleaded down to a £50 fine. 2 missing lodgers last known at the same address. 3 girls gone from the care system within a 30-mile radius. A missing student, a missing Swiss traveller, a missing schoolgirl, all along the same corridor of roads. Every fragment sat in a different drawer, different counties, different forces, different filing systems, no national database, no pattern analysis, no one whose job it was to hold the fragments up to the light together. The West case would later become a foundational argument for exactly those reforms, but in 1979 the fragments just sat there. And at 25 Cromwell Street, the digging stopped being for graves and went back to being for extensions. Fred West, in the years that followed, would build over the burial sites himself. A patio here, a bathroom there, concrete poured by the man who knew precisely what it sealed. After August 1979, the pattern breaks. For the next 8 years, no victim has ever been attributed to Fred and Rose West. And before this case can be honestly told, that gap has to be looked at directly, because investigators never found a satisfying answer to it. Serial offenders of this intensity do not, in the documented literature, simply stop. 3 explanations have been argued. First, that they did stop hunting strangers, that the household itself, the growing number of children now reaching adolescence, absorbed the couple's violence entirely. There is documented support for this. The 1980s inside Cromwell Street were, by the children's later testimony, the worst years of their lives. Second, that there are victims from the 1980s who were never found and never linked. A possibility Fred West himself, fed with hints, taunts, and half-confessions in his final year, and which the missing small bones from every recovered grave do nothing to quiet. Third, the most uncomfortable, some combination of both. The official record chooses silence. So will we, past this point, but you should know the gap is there and that it has never been explained. What the 1980s were, verifiably, was the era of the regime. The West children, there were now 8 in the house, with more to come, grew up inside a system of control that would later take days of trial testimony to describe. The 2 oldest girls bore the worst of it. And Marie, Fred's daughter by Rena, was subjected to years of abuse by both adults. She left the house around age 15, as soon as she physically could. And as she left, the pattern that criminologists call grooming succession moved down one place. Attention turned to Heather, Fred, and Rose's eldest biological daughter. Heather West resisted. That sentence is short, and it should be heavy. By her mid-teens, Heather was, by every sibling's account, the one who fought back. Sullen at school, defiant at home, refusing. Teachers noticed a withdrawn, troubled girl. One report was made after Heather confided in a friend about conditions at home, and the friend's parents contacted authorities. The check that followed found nothing actionable. The children, trained for years, said what they had been trained to say. The system touched the house one more time, and one more time it let go. In June 1987, Heather West was 16. She had just left school and was waiting on a job offer at a holiday camp in Devon, a way out, the first legal, unstoppable exit any of the West children had ever been close to reaching. The job fell through. Days later, Heather disappeared from the house. The other children came home to be told their sister had gone, left for Devon anyway, walked out to start her own life. No missing person report was ever filed. She was 16, of working age. Her own parents said she had left home. There was no mechanism, none, that would ever come looking. She had not left. Heather West was killed at home by her parents. The precise circumstances, contested forever after between Fred's shifting confessions and Rose's total denial, dismembered and buried in the back garden of 25 Cromwell Street. Fred West had one of his younger sons help him dig the hole, telling the boy it was a drainage trench, a fact the son would learn the meaning of 7 years later and carry for the rest of his life. Then Fred built a patio over it, and here this case pivots on something no investigator, no profiler, no system engineered: a family joke. In the years after 1987, when the younger West children misbehaved, Fred and Rose would tell them to behave or they'd end up under the patio like Heather. Understand what that phrase was inside the house, a threat calibrated to enforce silence, effective precisely because the children half believed it. But language like that does not stay inside a house with that many children in it. It leaked to friends, in asides at school, in the dark humor children use to carry what they cannot say. The joke about the patio began slowly over years to circulate in the small world around the West children. The couple had survived 20 years of police contact, court appearances, and social services visits. What they could not survive was their own sentence, repeated by their own children. The beginning of the end came in 1992, and it came, fittingly for this case, not from detective brilliance, but from a child finally being heard. In May 1992, one of the younger West daughters disclosed to a school friend that she was being abused at home. Fred had also been filming inside the house. The friend told her mother. The mother went to the police, and this time the case landed on the desk of someone who did not let go, Detective Constable Hazel Savage of Gloucestershire Constabulary, an officer who, in a coincidence this story could not have scripted, had encountered the West orbit before. As a young officer in the 1960s, she had taken statements from Rena Costello, Fred's first wife, and knew firsthand the fear Fred West generated in the women around him. On August 6, 1992, police executed a search warrant at 25 Cromwell Street looking for evidence of child abuse. They found it, enough to arrest both Fred and Rose. The 5 youngest children were taken into care. The abuse prosecution, however, collapsed in June 1993, when 2 key witnesses declined to testify. The same mechanism, the same fear that had saved the Wests in 1961 and 1973. Fred and Rose West walked out of the abuse case free. For the 3rd time in 30 years, the system had held them in its hands and opened its fingers. But this time, something was different, and her name was Hazel Savage. During the abuse investigation, interviewing the West children and their circle, Savage kept hitting the same strange sediment at the bottom of every conversation. The joke. Heather's under the patio. The children, now safely in care and slowly, cautiously beginning to talk, repeated it. Savage did what no institution had done in 27 years of fragments. She pulled the thread. Where was Heather West? There was no missing person report. Savage went looking for the paper trail a living 19-year-old must leave. National insurance records, tax, benefits, medical registration, employment. She found nothing. In 5 years, Heather West had not drawn a benefit, paid a contribution, seen a doctor, or held a job anywhere in the United Kingdom. Officially, she had left home. Administratively, she had ceased to exist. Savage pushed for a decision that senior officers hesitated over for months. The cost, the disruption, the possibility of digging up a family's garden and finding nothing but a family joke. It took until February 1994 to get the warrant. On the afternoon of February 24, 1994, police arrived at 25 Cromwell Street with a warrant to excavate the garden for the remains of Heather West. Fred was at a job site. Rose was home. Officers began breaking up the patio Fred had laid over his daughter. When Fred returned that evening, he was arrested. And in the interview room that night and into the following day, Fred West made a calculation that tells you everything about how he had survived so long. He tried to trade a body for the house's secrets. First, denial. Then, on February 25th, as the digging continued, a confession. Yes, he had killed Heather, an accident, an argument that went wrong. He alone. Rose knew nothing. He told them where to dig. It was one more transaction. Give them Heather, and the garden gives up one grave and it ends there. It might have worked, except for the ground itself. The excavation team, working with a forensic archaeologist, found human remains that first evening. But as they recovered them, the bone count came back wrong. There was a third femur. 3 thigh bones do not belong to one body. The garden of 25 Cromwell Street did not contain a grave. It contained graves. And with that single surplus bone, the transaction collapsed. The perimeter of the investigation exploded from one missing girl to an unknown number, and the diggers moved from the garden toward the house, toward the cellar Fred West had soundproofed 20 years before. What happened at 25 Cromwell Street over the following weeks became one of the largest forensic excavations in British history, conducted in the full glare of the world's press, which descended on Gloucester within days and turned a residential street into a broadcast set. The house was scaffolded and tented. The garden was gridded and sieved. And then the teams moved inside, guided by ground-penetrating survey and by Fred West himself, because Fred, having lost the single grave gamble, changed strategy entirely. If the house was going to give up its dead anyway, he would narrate. Over the days that followed his arrest, in sessions that would eventually total 107 recorded police interviews, more than 50 hours of tape, Fred West talked and talked and talked. The recovery ran through March 1994. Heather West, in the garden, under the patio. Shirley Robinson and her unborn child in the garden. Alison Chambers in the garden. Then the house. Linda Goff, beneath the ground floor bathroom. And in the cellar, the soundproofed cellar, the room the children were forbidden to enter, 5 more. Carol Ann Cooper, Lucy Partington, Therese Siegenthaler, Shirley Hubbard, Juanita Mott, 9 victims in the property. Every recovery showed the same signatures. Dismemberment performed with consistent method, bodies compressed into shafts rather than laid in graves. Evidence of binding or restraint in the majority. And from every single burial, small bones missing. Fingers, toes, kneecaps, sections of wrist, dozens of bones in total, absent across every site, too consistently to be excavation error. Fred West was asked about it directly, repeatedly. He never answered. It remains unexplained to this day. The case's permanent, deliberate blank, and the strongest single piece of evidence that what happened in that cellar was ritualized, repeated, and meant. Identification was its own forensic landmark. This was 1994. DNA profiling existed, but was young, and several victims had been missing for 2 decades, with no reference samples banked. The teams worked backward through dental records, skeletal analysis, and one technique the case made famous: facial superimposition, video mapping photographs of missing young women over the recovered skulls until, one by one, the anonymous dead got their names back. For the families, the spring of 1994 was a procession of 20-year-old wounds reopening on the evening news. Lucy Partington's family learned she had been 20 miles away the entire time. Linda Guff's mother learned the woman who had answered the door in her daughter's slippers had been standing over her grave. Fred's confessions, meanwhile, were becoming their own investigation and their own weapon. On tape, Fred West is by turns folksy, boastful, evasive, and grotesquely casual, narrating atrocity in the tone of a man describing a plumbing job. He confessed to the 9 at Cromwell Street. He directed police out of Gloucester entirely, to the fields of his childhood, to Letterbox Field in Much Marcle, where Rena Costello was recovered in April 1994, and to Fingerpost Field, where Anna McFall and her unborn child were found that June. With Charmaine already recovered from Midland Road, the count stood at 12. 12 identified victims across 4 sites, spanning 1967 to 1987. But run the tapes again and listen for what Fred is doing rather than what he is saying, because the interviews had one consistent architecture beneath all the rambling. Every version protected Rose. Fred confessed to murders in configurations that shifted week to week. Accidents, jealous rages, lodgers who had to go. But in every telling, he acted alone. Rose knew nothing. Rose was innocent. He said it so often, so insistently, and so unprompted that investigators began to read it as its own kind of evidence. No one mounts that constant a defense of a person who needs no defending. And the physical evidence was already speaking against it. Charmaine had died while Fred was in prison. Caroline Owens, alive and now ready to testify, had been assaulted by both of them, and it was Rose she described as the more frightening. Surviving witnesses to the couple's sexual violence across 2 decades put Rose not at the edge of events, but at their center, often as initiator. The prosecution theory assembled itself. Not a killer and his passive wife, but a functioning predatory partnership in which each was the other's audience, accelerant, and alibi. Rose West's strategy was the exact inverse of her husband's, and the contrast between them is one of the most studied dynamics in British criminal history. Arrested in April 1994 and charged as the case built, Rose said, in effect, nothing, and what she did say was denial so total it extended even to things that were provable. She denied the murders, denied knowledge of the murders, denied the abuse that her own children had described in documented detail, denied the assault on Caroline Owens that she had pleaded guilty to in 1973. Where Fred flooded the tapes, Rose starved them. Interviewers described a flat, hostile, unreachable presence. If Fred's 50 hours were a performance of harmlessness, Rose's silence was a wager, that with no forensic evidence tying her hands to any body, no confession, and Fred loudly absorbing all guilt, no jury could be certain of her. It was not a stupid wager. Legal commentators at the time genuinely doubted the case against her would hold. Then, on January 1st, 1995, Fred West adjusted the odds. Awaiting trial on 12 counts of murder, held at Winson Green Prison in Birmingham, he waited until the skeleton staffing of New Year's Day, braided a rope from strips of bedsheet and the reinforced tapes of laundry bags, a construction he had prepared over days, with the same patient handiwork the seller had known, and hanged himself in his cell. He left notes addressed to Rose, declarations of eternal love, including the wish to be buried beside her. He left no confession, no map to other victims, no answers about the missing bones, no explanation of the silent years. He had spent 50 hours talking and died having said in every way that mattered nothing. Understand what that suicide did to the case, because its effects ran in 2 directions at once. Legally, it beheaded the prosecution's simplest path. The man who confessed was gone, and with him any prospect of turning his testimony. Every count against Rose would now have to be proven without a perpetrator's account, against a defendant who denied everything. And her defense gained its central argument, one her barrister would drive at relentlessly. The dead man did it. The dead man said so. 50 hours of tape, and the Crown was prosecuting a widow because the guilty party had escaped them. But psychologically and strategically, Fred's death also freed the prosecution from him. His tapes, self-serving, contradictory, worthless as truth, no longer had to be litigated as an account of events. The case against Rose West would be built instead on the living, on Caroline Owens, on Anne-Marie, on the lodgers and survivors of 2 decades, and on the cold arithmetic of Charmaine's death behind a prison wall. The trial of Rosemary West, the biggest murder trial in England since the Yorkshire Ripper, was set for Winchester Crown Court, October 1995. She faced 10 counts of murder, and the entire question before the jury reduced to one sentence the prosecution would place at the center of its case. In a house that small, over years that long, with victims held that close. She must have known. Now it had to be proven. The trial of Rosemary West opened at Winchester Crown Court on October 3, 1995, before Mr. Justice Mantell, with Brian Levison QC leading for the Crown and Richard Ferguson QC for the defence. 10 counts of murder: Charmaine West, Heather West, Shirley Robinson, and 7 of the young women recovered from Cromwell Street. Note the exclusions: Anna McFall and Rena Costello, the 2 victims buried in Fred's fields before and outside Rose's proven orbit, were not on the indictment. The Crown charged only what it believed it could anchor to her. The prosecution's problem was stark, and Levison stated it plainly. There was no direct evidence, no witness to any killing, no forensic trace tying Rose's hands to any body, no confession. The case was circumstantial by necessity, and so the Crown built it the only way it could be built, as an architecture of pattern. Strand 1. Geography. Victims buried beneath the rooms of a small, crowded house Rose West ran. Held there, the restraint evidence said, possibly for days, in a household she controlled down to the children's chore rotations. The proposition that this happened around her 10 times, without her knowledge, was not an alternative explanation. It was an insult to the jury's intelligence. Strand 2. Charmaine, the timeline anchored to prison records, the death that could not be Fred's. If Rose had killed once alone, the passive bystander defense was dead at the root. Strand 3. And this was the trial's legal hinge: similar fact evidence. The survivors. The judge ruled the Crown could call the living to prove the pattern that produced the dead. Caroline Owens took the stand and described 1972, the abduction, the assault, Rose's active initiating role. Anne-Marie described years of paired abuse. A woman testified about assaults in the mid-1970s, bearing the same signatures found on the victims. The defense fought the admission of every strand, on exactly the grounds law students still debate. None of these witnesses had seen a murder. The judge let it in. The pattern was the case. Ferguson's defense was, in its logic, clean. Fred did it. Fred confessed to it, alone, on 50 hours of tape. Fred was a proven compulsive liar and killer who had deceived everyone, police, courts, social services, for 30 years. That a man that skilled at concealment could conceal things from his own wife was not merely possible, it was his defining talent. Rose was guilty. Ferguson effectively conceded, of a squalid and violent private life, But depravity is not murder, and the Crown was asking the jury to bridge that gap with inference alone. Then, in early November, Rose West took the stand in her own defense, a decision analyzed ever since because it is widely judged to have destroyed her. For 3 days, the jury watched her deny everything, including the 1973 guilty plea, the abuse her children described in forensic detail, events with living witnesses sitting in the building. Confronted with contradictions, she retreated into flat, affectless denial or sudden hostility. The jury had been asked by her own counsel to believe she was a deceived innocent. What they watched instead, day after day, was a witness they could not believe about anything, and a prosecution given license to display at length exactly the controlling coldness it had alleged. On November 21st and 22nd, 1995, after deliberating, the jury returned unanimous verdicts, guilty on all 10 counts. Mr. Justice Mantell sentenced Rosemary West to life imprisonment, telling her in a single sentence of judicial finality, "If attention is paid to what I think, you will never be released." In 1997, the Home Secretary imposed a whole life order, one of only a handful ever applied to a woman in British history. Her appeal was refused in 1996. She has maintained her innocence and her silence ever since, now in her 70s, one of the longest-serving women in the British prison system, and statistically certain to die there. The House did not survive the case. In October 1996, Gloucester City Council demolished 25 Cromwell Street entirely, and understanding why tells you what the case had done to the country. Every brick was crushed, the timbers burned, the rubble ground and dispersed to deny souvenir hunters a single fragment. The site today is a paved pedestrian walkway, deliberately unmarked. Britain has erased addresses before, but rarely with that thoroughness. It was not urban planning. It was exorcism. The institutional reckoning was slower and harder to demolish. The inquiries that followed mapped the failure chain you have now watched in full. 1961, released. 1972, £50. Lodgers vanishing from a known address. Care home girls filed as absconders across county lines that no database crossed. A 1992 abuse case collapsed by witness fear. A murdered 16-year-old whose non-existence in every government record went unnoticed for 7 years because no one was required to look. The West case became a standing citation in the reform of UK missing persons procedure and interforce intelligence sharing, and a foundational case study alongside the parallel horror of its era for why child disclosures must be heard the first time. Hazel Savage, the detective who pulled the thread everyone else had walked past, remains the case's answer to its own darkest question. The system did not catch Fred and Rose West. A person did, by refusing to stop asking one administrative question about one forgotten girl. And now the ending this case actually deserves, not the verdict, but the arithmetic. The official count is 12. Sit with what that number excludes. Mary Bastom, 15, gone from a Gloucester bus stop in 1968, known to Fred, never found. Police excavated the cafe site as recently as 2021 and recovered nothing. Fred, who confessed to so much, went to his death refusing to speak her name onto the record, reportedly telling his son he had killed her while denying it to police. The 8 silent years of the 1980s, unexplained in a case history where such gaps almost never mean nothing. Fred's own taunts in his final months, remarks to officers and family hinting at a number far beyond 12. At more out there, in fields no one had thought to dig. Worthless as evidence. Impossible, coming from him, to fully dismiss. And the missing bones, dozens of them, kept or disposed of somewhere never located, by a man who marked every kill the same way and explained none of it. Senior investigators on the case said publicly, after it closed, that they believed the true number was higher. Some said 20 or more. No one will ever establish it. Fred West's last act was to make sure of that, which returns us finally to the question this case was always really about, because how could they do it is the question for the couple, but how could no one see is the question for everyone else, and it is the one with the answer that matters. Nobody suspected the Wests because everything about them was calibrated to the exact frequency the world tunes out. Poor but working, rough but familiar, a full house on an ordinary street, a builder always improving his property, a big family always slightly in trouble but never quite enough. They did not hide from the community. They hid inside it, inside its noise, its assumptions, its reflex to file a missing girl as a runaway and a child's dark joke as a joke. 12 confirmed victims across 20 years in the middle of a city. The lesson of Cromwell Street was never that monsters are clever. It is that ordinariness is a mask no one checks, and that the whole time the neighbors were saying nothing ever happens around here. It was happening 30 feet from the pavement under a patio, a father built with his son, over a daughter neither of them could mention. They lived among us. They always do.